Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, November 4th, 2025. I still say- And our friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you. Thank you again, Nima. Good to be back.
Sorry, yeah, sorry for being late. We have some sort of confusion with the time change that the Eastern time has changed, and that's why we had some sort of confusion here. And please subscribe and hit like button. Let's start, John, with the Russian strategy today as time goes by. Donald Trump, in his interview on 60 Minutes, he said that he has no more leverage on Russia to put more pressure on Russia. Where are we going with Russia and the Trump strategy? Do you think that Russia is in the process of changing, modifying its strategy in Ukraine?
No, uh, indeed, the there's no sign of that there's any change on the battlefield, except that some of the restrictions on the general staff uh, planning and targeting, which President Putin has implemented for some time now, have lifted. So what we have is a full exercise of the electric war strategy that we've described before, with targeting of electric supply, grids, production capacities, and so forth, all the way to the Polish border. Second, along the front, what we have is a series of encirclements, cauldrons, or pockets, depending on what military language you speak, as the Russian side moves westward. It's encircling major groups of Ukrainian forces. President Putin has publicly uh, offered a form of uh, surrender, plus an ability of foreign journalists to observe the situation and how dire it is. That's been rejected. So the normal build up of first of artillery preparation, of drone and other forms of bombardment to soften up each of these areas before Russian forces move, the tactical shifts so as to deceive the Ukrainian side of the main targets and forms of direction. All of that, all of the tactical operations are in play now. The level of casualties, which are daily reported by the Defense Ministry, whether you agree with the numbers or not, the rate is going up 10%, 15% per week, so that the casualty figures, so that the level of losses is increasing. I see no sign of any change of military tactics, military operations, or targets. On the other hand, um, what you could say is that the President Putin's hopes and expectations and plans for some form of negotiated settlement short of um, full military conquest, those hopes have been abandoned because the Trump administration, and in combination with the Europeans and Zelensky, have all failed to come to any form of terms.
John, we had the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping and the president of China. You see two different somehow attitude on the part of Xi and Putin. Considering that Russia is at war, it's somehow the West is at war with Russia in Ukraine, and they're fighting Russia for more than we're approaching 4 years of the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes.
But the conflict between China and the United States is mostly economic, and it's about tariffs or these sort of you know issues. But how do you see the way that on the other hand, when you look at the difference between the way that Putin sees the meeting with Donald Trump and she sees that, because
Mm.
Putin had nobody in Washington to talk with before Donald Trump coming to power. That was a huge difference. That was a some that could be the source of this sort of, because looking at Putin and she was totally, he wasn't that much excited about meeting with Donald Trump. You see that in the way that they're behaving. But it was different when it came to the meeting between Putin and Donald Trump. How do you see that? How do you see the way that Russia sees Donald Trump? Do you think that is changing in the mind of Russians as time goes by?
As time goes by, yes. But we're talking about different kinds of escalation dominance. Um, on the one hand, you could ask the question, and it's asked privately, not so publicly, but increasingly since the Busan meeting between Xi and Trump. Why doesn't Putin cut off the Ukraine from Poland as forcefully as to convince Trump to come to terms, as forcefully as President Xi cut off rare metal supply from the United States, which has had the effect of triggering a significant retreat by Trump on all the major economic warfare threats he had listed and began to implement against China. Now, on the one hand, and you've said it, and thank you for saying it, Nima, you have a significant difference. China is a dominant um, economic power and has economic dominance vis-a-vis the United States, such that it could threaten a degree of disruption of the US economy, both from rare metals and other goods, inflation effects, and so on, which President Putin and Russia does not have as an economic power. On the other hand, there's no question that Russia has military escalation dominance on the battlefield, but hasn't used it to the extent that many people think that the general staff has been aiming at. And why hasn't President Putin exercised the degree of escalation dominance on a, on the battlefield, militarily speaking, as Xi showed he was capable of on the battlefield of economic warfare? Since and that's a very interesting problem. You also saw that President Putin, in his approach to Trump in Alaska at the Anchorage summit meeting in mid-August, showed a degree of how to say ingratiation towards Trump that Xi refused to show. I've called them the Chinese nose. There was no Chinese endorsement of Trump's so-called peacemaking efforts in the Middle East. There was from President Putin. There was no Chinese endorsement of President Trump's seeking the Nobel Peace Prize. President Putin said that, Xi ignored it. There were no Chinese smiles, no smiles. President Putin went out of his way to smile. The approach that Putin adopted was pretty much consistent with all of the Europeans, all of the Asian leaders, including Prime Minister Modi, who've met with Trump. Let's call it ingratiation. We've seen it described as catering to Trump's vanity and so forth, allowing Trump to grandstand and so forth. What one saw was Xi in the coldest display of meeting Trump that anyone has shown. And it left Trump indisputably. You could see it on his face, you could see it in his movements. You can see there's a telltale movement at the end of the meeting as Trump tries to touch Xi, whispers in his ear as Xi heads into his car. And then immediately Xi has gone. You see Trump walk off the stage, as it were, gesturing and moving much quicker. With Xi, Trump was awkward and the ingratiation was reversed. Why did President Putin act differently? And what benefited Putin or the Russian side on the military battlefield for acting that way? And the answer is he gained nothing. Therefore, he's learned a lesson. One gains nothing. Now, what I've done is, in preparation for today, I looked at the way in which the Trump White House has issued fact sheets after each of their meetings with significant allied leaders and with Xi. From August the 16th until today, the White House issued 36 fact sheets. They call them fact sheets. And each of these have been issued to document and itemize the terms of agreement which Trump officials say they've made with each of these head of government figures that they've met. 36 of them. They issued one in September 5, for example. Since the meeting in Alaska, August 16, they've issued 36. One in September 5 with the Japanese Prime Minister, then September 19 after Trump met with Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK, on October 9 after Trump had met with Finland's President Alexander Stubb, on October 20 there was one after Trump had met with Prime Minister Albanese of Australia to sign an arms, minerals and trade agreement. And then between October 26 and 29, there were terms of agreement that were spelled out in these fact sheets at Trump's meetings with heads of government in Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea. Then finally, on November 1, the White House spelled out in a fact sheet what the White House says Trump and Xi agreed at their meeting 48 hours earlier. There were 10 points listed as Chinese actions, 5 points American actions, and 5 other points which the US side claimed, but the Chinese haven't confirmed. But there's not a single fact sheet issued identifying anything Trump and White House officials say they've agreed with President Putin. No terms of agreement between the US and Russia since August 16 summit. No terms of points of agreement they followed up with in their telephone call on October 16. Now, that tells you a number of things, and it explains, I believe, a number of things. Remember that, and we've said it on this program, the Russians issued a 32-point detailed plan, points, terms for settling the Ukraine conflict. I can hold it up, but it was issued publicly, published at the beginning of June, just before the last meeting between the Ukrainian side, the Russian side in Istanbul. The Russians have published their 32-point plan. The Ukrainians plus the US and the Europeans have reached a 22-point plan, according to General Kellogg, the intermediary between the Trump White House and the Europeans. That's never been published. So there's no shortage of public understanding of what the Russian terms are. There's simply been a refusal on the US side to explain what the terms were. Now, one explanation for the absence is that Trump has never agreed to any of the terms Putin discussed with him. Another explanation is that Trump agreed with Putin and then changed his mind. A third explanation is that Trump vacillates. He didn't mean to change his mind, but's been persuaded to do so by the European allies, by some of Trump's subordinates in the administration itself, at State, at Pentagon, and CIA. A fourth explanation is that Putin has aimed to preserve escalation dominance on the battlefield while allowing Trump to appear that he and the European allies aren't losing the war. A fifth explanation for this lack of exchange of terms, the lack of public disclosure, the constant apparent change that Trump shows towards the Russian side. The fifth explanation is that Putin and Trump have agreed to bide or buy time from each other, delaying the public realization and the political cost of who has the weaker and stronger hand. And the sixth explanation is that all of the explanations I've just given you are true at more or less the same time. That can be described by many people as Trump's confusion, as Putin's uncertainty, as both sides are having one set of terms and then changing them, or that the European allies persuade the US to change its line from time to time. Either way, you've got a situation which we come to in which as you said, sometimes Trump has been in favor of a peace agreement with ceasefire to follow, which is in the Russian 32-point plan. But most recently, he adopted the tough line, calling Putin paper tiger, saying the Russian economy is collapsing. When he adopted the severe sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, the oil sanctions aiming to cut off the oil trade between Russia, China, and Japan, he said that that was conditioned on Russia coming to an immediate ceasefire. That was the European line. Well, the Russian side was never going to come to an immediate ceasefire. And so we come to where we are today. I need to point out that what you see when you look at the way the White House looks at these things, President Trump's job approval in public opinion polling up to today is his job approval is getting lower and lower. In other words, American voters aren't paying attention to the details of these negotiations. Arguably, they don't care about the terms. They might care about war with Venezuela. We'll come to that later. But they don't care about the details. What they are saying to Trump is, there's a higher level of disapproval. I'm just looking at my papers. It's up to 53.6% disapproval. It's going up over the last 2 weeks. Approval is going down. The gap is getting wider, wider, wider. 10 percentage points now. So, and the gap between approval and disapproval, a higher rate of disapproval, is almost 20% on American voter attitudes to Trump's handling of the Ukraine war. So Trump is facing increasing dismay and disapproval of his conduct of this war settlement, and he won't come to terms for that. Therefore, he, with respect to China, he retreated rapidly to save essentially the election costs, the voter costs, the disapproval that's mounting inside the United States for the accelerated war against China. he thinks he can get away with pursuing war against Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield, but he can't. Disapproval's mounting. So he's left these hints that Russia should finish the war. Perhaps I should leave them to fight it out. And he moves to the notion not that Russia's economy is crumbling or that Russia's vulnerable to long-range missile attacks and so forth, but rather that Russia can and should finish it quickly. All of these ideas that he expresses don't address the terms, but leave President Putin much freer to act.
John, you mentioned one of the lines that you mentioned is that Donald Trump has changed his mind. How, looking at Donald Trump, you remember Putin during the, the election in the United States, he said that we prefer predictability in the United States.
Yes.
And it's still the same case, the same issue with Russia, in my opinion. And they don't know how to deal with Donald Trump. They don't know how runs Washington, who runs Washington, and how do they consider their main objective in Ukraine. Who's running the show in Washington? Let's put it this way. I don't see Tulsi Gabbard being in that circle. Even JD Vance is not that much, in my opinion, connected with what's going on with Washington. Who's changing Donald Trump's mind and the policies in Washington, if that's the case? John, I lost your voice. Yeah, nothing is coming. You're not muted. It seems that your mic is disconnected. It seems. No, you're muted right now.
I don't know why.
Yeah, you're back. You're back. You're back, John. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. You're asking a Russia correspondent, albeit a former Carter White House official, to talk about Washington. But first, can I correct you? There are factions of decision-making in Russia also that have different ideas about how to deal with Washington. So we for the sake of simplification for those listening, we talk of the General Staff and the Security Council, which combines the military, the intelligence services, the foreign ministry, and the former president, Dmitry Medvedev. There is the Kremlin group, headed, of course, by the president. And there's always been a faction in business, at the central bank, and elsewhere that wants to restore business as usual, that didn't want the war at the beginning, that wasn't prepared to protect Russia's assets abroad, that want to reach an accommodation with the United States at almost any military price, security price, in order to restore business as they once pursued it. So there are a variety of factions. The business faction is represented by Kirill Dmitriev, who's been the president's emissary to discuss business, money transfers, and who's negotiated with Stephen Witkoff on the US side. So there are differences on the Russian side. To suggest, so each of them has a different idea, a different theory, looks at the evidence differently of the way in which President Trump behaves. I suggest, and we've said it before, that to attribute consistent mind to President Trump is an exaggeration. He doesn't have anything like the intellectual capacities. He doesn't read as former presidents have. He doesn't have a regular daily intelligence briefing. He has one a week. he relies principally on officials like Vice President Vance. His depth of contact at the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon is limited. He's interested primarily in presentation, in votes, in making money to a degree that no previous president has pursued, making money for his family, making money from each of his foreign policy maneuvers, and making money with and through Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, Stephen Witkoff, the Special Advisor, Feinberg, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and others. So what suits them is a couple of things. One, each of their so-called peacemaking efforts has been accompanied by a business opportunity and payoffs. Second, they can never afford to risk loss, defeat, retreat. Though they suffered it at Busan at the hands of President Xi, they don't characterize it that way. The White House fact sheet, as I've just described it, indicates 10 concessions from China, 5 from the United States. And the fact is that the major achievement has been to put off and postpone a negotiation of the major issues in dispute, the TikTok sale, the export of Blackwell chips to China, the 50% rule that subjects thousands of Chinese companies to export controls. These have not been decided. These have been postponed. And though the postponement period is 12 months, in fact, it's 6 months. The Chinese retain escalation dominance because they've agreed there might be a Trump-Xi summit meeting in China in April next year. There can't be such a meeting unless there's an agreement on the undecided fundamentals. That means they have to be negotiated within 6 months, not 12. So under these pressures, Trump retreated. All of them retreated. And not too happily, Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, announced that the Chinese had made a mistake employing their ban on rare earth metals to the United States. It was the other way around, but never mind. Your question was, how does the Trump administration think, and therefore how should the Russian side calculate? Yes, and the answer is, under pressure of escalation dominance on the Russian side, they retreated. They ran away. They covered their retreat with a smokescreen. Trump followed the others in 1 hour, 40 minutes in accepting the retreat. So the argument for the Russian side, the lesson, let's say, for the Russian side, the lesson for the Indian side, for the lesson for all who are, let's say, in the crosshairs of President Trump's threat campaign, military campaign, economic pressure campaign, is find the vulnerabilities on the American side and understand your advantages to play those vulnerabilities until their pips squeak, so to speak. Then the United States side will retreat. Now, the Russian side has, as we said, military escalation dominance on the battlefield and can exercise it and is exercising it. Can Iran exercise its comparable escalation capacity against Israel and the United States? Question mark. Can President Maduro and the Venezuelan government build up quickly sufficient defense capacity, air defense capacity, for example, to threaten President Trump with a Bay of Pigs risk, the risk of an attack on Venezuela that would result in significant numbers of US casualties? Would President Trump accept, run a Bay of Pigs risk in Venezuela? The answer is almost certainly no. And when you referred to Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, I guess you're referring to her statement in Bahrain the other day, suggesting that interventions for regime change ought to be past policy. They generate more risks, more violence, more losses, both for their target countries and for the United States. They should be put in the back mirror, she said. Now, looking carefully at what she said, it's arguable that she's on the out in terms of both the intelligence sharing and the operations that have been mounted in Venezuela. She did not register what must be her clear understanding that Trump has admitted to publicly. That's the order to the CIA allowing them to conduct clandestine regime overthrow operations in Venezuela. If she opposes it, she virtually said so in Bahrain. But that operation's been underway for months. She's failed to stop it so far. Second, there are two Russian views about how the United States will attack Venezuela. One is the covert route, and that appears to be what Gabbard opposes. That would be to create an internal Machado Maidan. That's to say, a demonstration like the Maidan demonstration, which turned into violence, triggered internally by the secret services of the plotters, not by President Yanukovych's men, which became in part the rapid disintegration of the Yanukovych government and his flight out of Kiev and his replacement. Can the US candidate Maria Machado mount such a comparable Maidan and then, with violence, call for President Trump to intervene to save Venezuelan lives? Would that cover the qualification expressed in Gabbard's speech? Is it regime change, or has the Maduro government acted against its own people? The line that was adopted for intervention in Libya, for example, it resulted in Muammar Gaddafi's murder, endorsed by Hillary Clinton, as we all remember. Remember that the US line has been that Maduro heads a drug cartel. The United States is not constitutionally or operationally at war with a country. It's operating to save the United States against a criminal syndicate, not a government. Both of those, cover stories are false in fact, and an illegal evasion of the attempt to overthrow the government. Does Gabbard's apparent disinclination for regime change apply to individuals using a government as cover for a drug running operation? Possibly not. Possibly not. So The other Russian version of what will happen is to accept that Trump likes obliteration. Remember, we've talked about it on this program before. He thinks that he obliterated, using his Air Force, obliterated the Iranian nuclear weapons capacities. Obliteration is his favorite word because he believes in the capacities of the US military to destroy everything in a target. And there is a Russian view that it won't go covert and then followed by an intervention. It would start as an obliteration operation. That's simply speculation, and I see plenty of people in the podcast universe, plenty of people in the mainstream media speculating as to what will happen next. But I hope I've explained that the opposition Gabbard seems to have expressed is limited to her, and it carries the qualification that it might not apply to the removal of a drug cartel. And she hasn't, no one has, seriously challenged the so-called fentanyl theory that's behind the entire operation against Venezuela. But it's not the first time. I think I've said it here before. I wrote a book about 50 years ago of the history of cover stories like this to pursue the Chinese in California over opium in the 1880s and 90s, to pursue the Mexicans in the West over the beginning of the war against marijuana, and on it goes through the Vietnam. This is not a new technique to criminalize a target group, attack them, add to the law enforcement mechanisms in the United States, all of which makes drug running more profitable. Risky, yes, but more profitable. And in this case, it's used to cover regime change. So I don't know that I'm in better position than anyone else to say whether the intelligence community, the CIA, shares Gabbard's disinclination for a covert operation. However, the uncertainty now, I should think, is whether the Russian side can mount sufficiently quickly an improvement in Venezuela's capacity to inflict a Bay of Pigs risk. And that would be improved air defense. It would mean improved intelligence on the plotting of a Machado Maidan. It would mean many things that remain secret. And I'm in no position to say what that capacity is. But I have in no doubt that if Trump is advised, though not by Gabbard, that there's a Bay of Pigs risk, that there's a risk that US aircraft might be shot down, that US personnel landing would face death, that it's not a risk he can run.
Yeah.
He would dare to run.
John, we have just 3-4 minutes because of the problem with the confusion we had. We've lost 15 minutes, and the other guest is coming up. But before wrapping up, John, looking at the relationship between Iran and Russia today, Lavrov was asked about if they have sent S-400 to Iran. And his answer was somehow it was a yes, but he tried to say that we have no limits in this sort of participation, in this sort of partnership they have.
Yes.
How deep is that, looking at the partnership between Iran and Russia today comparing to what it was before the attack on Iran?
I'm not sure I understand. On the one hand, both of us agree, and you know more about this than I do.
I want to know how the war in Iran, the war between Iran and Israel has influenced the partnership between Iran and Russia.
Well, it's influenced both sides, has it not? Inside Iran, there was some opposition, Iranian opposition, um, Iranian military opposition to relying on the Russian air defense systems and the coordination by the of Russian technology for the air defense, and the subsequent outcome of the first round. Let's call it the first round of war, since we don't believe, either you nor me nor our audience believe, the war against Iran is over by any stretch of the imagination. That's the US-Israeli war. Now facing the second round, the opposition to increased Russian technical air defense, intelligence sharing, and so forth, that level of assistance has, the resistance to it in Iran has changed. Consequently, the depth that Foreign Minister Lavrov is talking about is, on the Russian side, the readiness to supply what the Iranian side is now willing to accept and pay for, as it turns out, and pay for. There's obviously a significant Iranian input to the Russian side's waging of the drone war in the Ukraine. So when Lavrov reflects depth, he's also talking about the depth of consensus on the Iranian side and on the Russian side in what needs to be done to impose, to create, to practice, and test a serious air defense capability that wasn't there when the Israelis and the United States attacked. Yeah. Could anything like Trump's bombing raid, the obliteration raid, be attempted again when the Iranian side fired no defense against the incoming US attackers? No, that won't happen again. So when Lavrov speaks of depth of defense, he's saying basically the US tries one of those again, it will meet a depth of air defense against which the US Air Force is unlikely to act. It will never, the US Trump administration, Trump personally, will never run the Carter risk of having planes down and a mission inside Iran fail as spectacularly as Jimmy Carter's raid to rescue the hostages in Tehran, as that occurred. That risk, like the Bay of Pigs risk, small raids, big losses, huge political cost. That risk, the Carter risk for Iran, the Bay of Pigs risk in Venezuela, those are risks which Trump will never dare to run. And I think President Xi showed President Trump is not the risk taker he likes to think of himself as being.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always. I have the other guests coming up. Thank you so much. Great pleasure, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. See you next week.
See you. Bye-bye. Yeah, we're going to have Patrik coming up in just in a minute. And our second guest is Patrik Baab. You know him. We have him on this podcast, and he's a journalist from Germany. And how's it going, Patrik?
I'm fine. So possibly we have to make a break.
Yeah, we are on live, just informing you. We are on live as we talk.
So that's important for me. So we have to go live. All right, let's start.
Yeah, exactly. Patrik, let me start with the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. we know that Russia is somehow escalating. We had two new missiles being announced by the Russian president. One of them was Burevestnik and Poseidon, both of them nuclear powered missiles. And even we had the Russian president talking about the Sarmat missile being, operational, sent to the battlefield soon. How is that going? Looking at battlefield today in Ukraine, do you think we are heading towards some sort of escalation that could bring Sarmat missiles? Maybe we have learned, the British government has sent, missiles. They call it, yeah, I just forgot the name of the missiles that they have sent recently to Ukraine. But in the United States, the Pentagon has decided to authorize this, the president of the United States to send Tomahawk missiles. It still depends on Donald Trump's decision to send them to Ukraine. But looking at what's going on, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, I have to say that the Russian Federation and NATO are escalating in different ways. NATO countries are escalating step by step, always a bit more, and then checking what's the result. The Russian Federation is escalating in another way. They are waiting and waiting and waiting, and at a certain point, they will answer with a hard strike. And this is a difference, and in the West, they don't understand this difference. It goes back to the experience of Rome and the large territory. This is the largest country in the world. And the strategy is always, let the enemy come into the room and wait for ice and snow, for the mud, and then at a certain point, when this point is very positive for your own side, then strike back as hard as you can. And this is a difference. And the West is escalating again, step by step. And Putin shows the West what will happen. And this is nuclear deterrence, which means we are ready to escalate until the last point, to the nuclear destruction of Europe. And, well, let's have a look at the front line. That makes the situation clear. On a front line of 1,400 kilometers, Russian troops are advancing. Pokrovsk is encircled. In the north, the Ukraine army is really under pressure. And the goal of the Russian Federation is not gaining territories. They want to destroy the enemy. And according to a leak of Russian computer experts, hackers, of the Ukraine general staff, we see an amount of killed and missed Ukraine soldiers of more than 1.7 million people. And I think this is reliable. And I would estimate the Russian losses on something between 100,000 and 200,000. This is related, I think, 150,000, 170,000. And this is related to the great power of artillery, drones, and missiles. And in these points, the Russian Federation is much stronger than Ukraine. I expect that the front line of Ukraine will break down in spring next year, and this is the end of the Ukraine state. This state will be divided. A western part and an eastern part, and the Russian army is in reaching these goals very successful. And the West is under pressure. And that makes the situation clear. What Putin told the West, showing those weapons, is we are ready for nuclear escalation. If you want to play hardball, we will do. We are the biggest country in the world. We have the best chance to survive a nuclear escalation in Europe. And this brings Trump under pressure. He thought he could make a deal, cut a deal, with a fast ceasefire. And the Russian Federation wants to meet the deeper roots of the conflict. And the goals of the Russian Federation are not ceasefire. The goals are a neutral Ukraine out of NATO, security and a safe life of the people, the Russian people in eastern Ukraine, and a new pan-European security order with clear claims. And Mr. Trump got more and more under pressure by the deep state in Washington. And we expect the midterm elections next year. And he has to fight for his majority in the parliament. And so he has to meet the ideas and the ideology and the political perspectives of the Republican Party, and large parts of the Republicans are warmongers. And Trump is under pressure by the European Union. So the European Union today is an anti-democratic warmonger despotism, nothing else. It is an anti-democratic despotism. And the European leaders know the only chance to survive for themselves is to continue the war, to prolong the war, because they brought their own countries in a dead-end street, financially, ideologically, and politically. Let me begin with the policy and the ideology. The war in Ukraine is the biggest lie that European population and people were told since the Second World War. It is absolutely not an unprovoked war of aggression. This war did not begin with the Russian invasion on February 24 in 2022. This war began with the NATO, EU, and USA orchestrated and organized coup of the Maidan in Kiev in February 2014. And after this coup, a wave of violence rolled through the eastern parts of the country against the Russian population. And this Russian population started to organize self-defense militias. So the war was orchestrated by the West. And it was very clear those days, in 2014, that the West wants a war in Ukraine. And after all, the Russian Federation did not see another chance but to invade, because they saw, as the OSCE observers and monitors as well, that the Ukraine side prepared for an attack against the separatist republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, for gaining Crimea as well in a military way. And this is the original reason of this war. It is the eastward expansion of NATO, including Ukraine. It is the strategy of the West to include Ukraine in the Western capitalistic circle and to break out Eastern Ukraine from the Russian area of influence. This is the background. That this is something all Western media are lying about. They are lying to their own people. And as long as they are lying, we won't find a way to peace. And European elites know that they brought their countries in a situation of completely losses when the cost of war will come in. So many European countries will face bankruptcy. That's very clear. So the only way to save themselves is to go on with the war. That's the background. And politicians like German Chancellor Friedrich Merz are nothing else than transmission belts of the American financial industry. And the refinancing of the German state by credits and credit obligations depends on the financial industry of the United States. So it is completely logic what he's doing. He's helping his former employer, BlackRock, nothing else. And the cost doesn't matter. In the end of the show, we will see a European Union completely broken down, and we will see in Europe a row of failed states. So the dystopia is a scene of the Hollywood movie Mad Max. And this is something I'm expecting of Europe. But this strategy of European leaders brings Trump under pressure, more and more. Possibly he has, in the administration, 2,000 men and women on his side. But the whole administration outnumbers 250,000 people. And so he cannot win against the deep state. He's surrounded by the deep state and really under pressure by his own party and the Europeans. So that's the situation I see.
Since the market of regime changes these days are so popular and active, and even Tulsi Gabbard was talking about the regime change, how devastating that could be in any country. Do you think that the idea of the war in Ukraine, Patrik, was to do regime change in Russia, one of the main goals? Do they still believe that delusional that would bring them to this sort of conclusion, that there is still have a possibility to do regime change in Russia by, they're talking about seizing Russian assets, sanctions after sanctions, even war, the continuation of the war that could harm Russia in a long run. Is that still the case in the mind of Europeans, at least? Not going to Americans.
Of course, the Europeans and NATO states tried to provoke a regime change in Russia to a more Western-friendly leader, president, to open up the Russian market for grabbing the resources of the Russian Federation, the minerals of the Russian Federation. This is always the goal. To get a new market in Russia, to get a Western-friendly government, and to bring Russia in a situation where they must sell out their minerals and resources for Western capitalism. But this strategy failed. It was a complete understanding of the situation. And the reason for that is most Western politicians don't know Russia. They have no idea what it is. They have no idea of the industrial power of this country. And so the strategy failed and the sanctions failed completely. For some reasons. First of all, the Russian Federation lies under sanctions since 2014, and the Russian industry and the Russian economy managed to live with these sanctions and to produce a lot of things which were imported in former years by themselves. The second thing is, more than 150 countries are dealing with the Russian Federation because they need Russian exports for their own countries. It's completely necessary. And so the Russian Federation is not isolated. The Europeans are isolated. And the third point is the Russian Federation is backed by China and India and other BRICS countries, because BRICS feels strong enough to stand to NATO and the United States. So we see a shift of power from the United States and from Europe to East Asia. And in this play, in this game, East Asia will win, because over there, they're living 3 or 4 billion people, much more as live in Europe or in the United States. And the industry of China is much stronger. This is rooted in the deindustrialization processes, especially in the United States, in the decades ago. So in the end of the show, the Western strategy failed completely. And according to the French historian Emmanuel Todd, we see in the Ukraine war a situation where neither side could step back. The Russian Federation is fighting a war of decision. They cannot accept that 500 kilometers far from Moscow, American missiles will be dislocated. And the West cannot step back, because this would be a worldwide sign for the decline of the West and the powerlessness of the West. And that's the situation we are facing right now.
I think many of us don't understand how the West sees the conflict in Ukraine, because if they see these people who are advocating, you mentioned the deep state in the United States, the main issue with them, in my opinion, right now is if we get along with Russia, if we find some sort of solution with Russia in Ukraine, that would mean that China would capture, Taiwan, and it seems we're sending them, a sign of weakness to China if we try to somehow compromise with Russia. Is that the case, Patrick? Does that have anything to do with the reality? Because China is so much rational. I look at China today. They know what do they want, what they want, what they wanna with Russia, with the West, and they are supporting Russia in the conflict in Ukraine because they know if something bad happens in Ukraine against Russia, they're gonna be the next. What's your understanding of one of the main goals, which would be on the part of the West, which if they compromise with Russia in Ukraine, then they have to do it with China as well in Taiwan. Is that the case?
This is something the former commander of the NATO troops in Europe, General Breedlove, told us in the year 2014. We have to win against the Russian Federation on Ukraine soil to show Beijing that we are strong enough and that we will fight every state who wants to go to stand up, to stand to the United States as the superpower, the single superpower of the world. But things changed. China today is much stronger, and Taiwan is a part of China. After the civil war in China in the late 40s, the dictator General Chiang Kai-shek flew to Taiwan. And this was a very bloody civil war. And nobody forgot that in China. The West has forgotten that. So Taiwan is a part of China. And the United States today want to make Taiwan a separate state, which isn't. It is a part of China. And on the other hand, the Western political strategy to bring the Russian Federation under pressure on Ukraine soil had the outcome that the Russian Federation and China are coming together more and more. They have difficulties with each other. That's very clear. But Beijing needs Russia as a mineral storage in the north, and Beijing doesn't want a weak state influenced by the United States in its north. So they will support Russia as long as this is necessary. On the other hand, Chinese companies are highly invested in Ukraine, in the black soil areas especially. I'm not sure, but about 5% of Ukraine's soil belong to China. So they want peace to exploit and to have a payback of this investment, but not to Western conditions, but to Russian conditions. And this is a difference. No NATO expansion to the east, a neutral Ukraine, which is dealing to a lot of countries, and situation in which the Russian people in Ukraine, the Russian minority, can live. But those areas now belong to the Russian Federation, and they won't return to Ukraine. The negotiation leader of the last negotiation round in Istanbul on the Russian side told the Ukraine delegation, these days we talked about 4 oblasts. Next time we will discuss 8 oblasts. And I expect that the Russian Federation will expand their zone of influence militarily until Odessa. They want to get Odessa. And in Odessa, this is a place of the British Secret Service and special troops of the UK. And I'm expecting a hard fight an encirclement of Odessa mid next year, for example, in the beginning or mid next year. It's difficult to make because the Dnieper is a very broad river, close to the Black Sea, about 2 miles. And it is difficult to cross the Dnieper River in a militarily way. But I'm expecting that the Russian Federation will do that. And the longer the West will continue the war, the more destruction we will see. So your first question was about escalation. And yes, the Russian side escalated. And the answer to long-range missiles heading for the Russian Federation was the destruction of the complete energy infrastructure of Ukraine. And things will go on. And the logic behind, in the perspective of Moscow, is we are going to destroy every industrial facility in Ukraine and the complete energy infrastructure, because when the western part of Ukraine will implement it in the European Union, this will be so expensive, the reconstruction will be so expensive that the European Union will destroy itself. And this is also something I'm expecting. This is the end of the European Union, because countries in the south around the Mediterranean, but also countries like Slovakia and Hungary, they will leave the European Union. They don't want to pay the European shithole. That's the problem. So those European elites brought themselves in a catastrophic situation.
Patrik, looking at Europe today, we know that Slovakia and Hungary were so much hopeful about Donald Trump and his administration, but it seems as time goes by, Donald Trump is perceiving that he cannot put a lot of pressure on India and China. They're big. The economy is so much, is a gigantic economy that he cannot go against. But when it comes to Slovakia and Hungary, he can put pressure on them. I don't know what's the point after all. Let's assume you're, somehow convincing Slovakia and Hungary not to receive Russian oil. Who's going to be able to provide them with energy? Germany has the same sort of issue. How is the future for Germany? Because that would be the same case for Hungary and Slovakia, and if they go in that direction, if they accept what the United States is asking for.
In a global perspective, Trump knows that his own country, the United States, are not strong enough to bring India and China and Russia under pressure at the same time. He's not strong enough. But you are right, he can bring the Europeans under real pressure. He's increasing the tribute of his European vassals. That's all. First, the vassals are driven in a bankruptcy to save the United States, and then the European vassals will be driven into a war in Ukraine. That's the strategy. Do what you want as Europeans. The main thing is to buy the weapons in the United States so we can make good deals. That's the strategy. And European today is, in foreign policy, in international policy, completely weak. They don't have a strategy. And the days will come up when the European economy will be very weak on a global scale. So that means Europe and the Europeans don't matter anymore. We are the Cape of Asia, as the French poet Paul Valéry wrote someday, 100 years ago. Nothing else. And we brought ourselves into this situation. And I fear there is no way back, because the population of Europe in all states is sleeping. And there is no pressure on the streets, no big protests, no demonstrations, and that means the elites do what they want. And they are leading ourselves into abyss. So I have a very negative expectation for Europe.
Do you feel, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, do you feel that Europe does have or is thinking of a long-term strategy in Ukraine? Or the case of Ukraine, you mentioned the Odessa. If Odessa is gone, that's the end for Ukraine. I don't see any sort of future, because they have the time. Donald Trump and his administration, together with European, they have time to save Odessa on some sort of, management for Odessa that could help Ukraine, the western part of Ukraine, being connected to the Black Sea. But if Odessa is gone, that's the end for Ukraine. Is Europe going, it's putting itself in the same position as Ukraine is becoming the isolated state with no connection to the Black Sea? How big Europe is able to bet on what's going on in Ukraine?
So it is a fight of survival on different front lines. And Ukraine is a main front line. And you mentioned the other front line. This is Taiwan. And another front line is the Caucasus region. And the next front line is the Baltic Sea. And I think NATO wants to bring this war on a larger scale. NATO wants to escalate in the Baltic Sea. And Europeans are trying to provoke regime changes, for example, in Georgia, in the Caucasian region, and in Moldova. On the other side, they are trying, and they are doing their very best. And they cannot understand that they will lose. Now we reached the 19th sanctions package. And all these packages ended up like a boomerang. The blowback was very heavy, and the Russian Federation was not so strongly affected by those sanctions packages. Well, always doing the same and expecting a different result. This is the definition of mental madness.
Yeah.
And I think what we see is a degenerated elite. This is an elite who is completely unable. Look at Starmer or Macron. Those people are completely unable to run a country. But people is sleeping. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin someday wrote, more than 100 years ago, revolutions will take place when the upper ones cannot go on and the lower ones don't want to go on. And today in Europe, we are in a situation where the upper ones cannot go on. They are in a completely dead-end street. But the lower ones, the normal people, wants to go on. They want to go on because they are also in a state of fatigation, of madness, or something else. I cannot explain that. People are unable to fight for their rights. And if you don't want to do something against the warmongers, you will end up at the front line. And this will be the fortune, yes, this will be the future of the German population.
Zelensky, how do you see the role of Zelensky in Ukraine? Do you think that the first step, if the West decides to do something in Ukraine, the first step would be removing Zelensky from power? And I'm not just talking about Zelensky himself. I'm talking about the movement behind Zelensky. And you mentioned the British role in Odessa. We know that the British intelligence is supporting Zelensky's, they're supporting even Zelensky to be the next president of Ukraine. Is that acceptable for Russia, or Russia prefers to something in the western part of Ukraine similar to what they had before the coup in 2014?
The Ukraine people will not have a future with Mr. Zelensky as president. And the survival of Zelensky depends on the war. When the war will end, the show is over for Zelensky. He will not stay in power anymore. Probably this is also his physical end. And the end of the war will bring the end of the government of the Ukraine fascists from Galicia, from Western Ukraine. So those people are very deeply interested to continue the war. And this makes very difficult for Mr. Trump to stop the war. Probably he can make a deal with Mr. Putin. But the fascist leaders of Ukraine will say, oh, we have a deal. That's a great show. But we right here will decide when the deal will work. And this is a difference. It's completely difficult to implement this deal, this possible deal. And the next crucial point is the deep cooperation between NATO and Ukrainian fascists. It's a deep cooperation. They know each other in military and in the secret services. They cooperated since 2 decades. These guys are friends. And I know officers of German military who closely cooperated with the current ambassador of the Ukraine in London, Zaluzhny. They know each other. But the body of Zaluzhny is full of swastikas. And what's that? Those people are fascists. And it will be very difficult to stop this. And Trump and his team tried to implement a deal to overtake the nuclear power plants of Ukraine. This is a smart idea. This was a smart idea. It will not happen, but it was a smart idea to take away the nuclear storages from the Ukraine fascists. This was a smart idea, but it will not work. So with the nuclear power plants, Ukraine fascists can blackmail everybody. They are sitting on nuclear material. So it was very easy to run into this war, and it will be very difficult to leave this war behind. Very difficult. So that's the situation. Because many political groups and the existence and the power of many political groups depends on the continuation of the war. It's not, we don't talk about the Ukraine people. Ukraine started in the independence in 1991 with a population of 52 million. And according to a former government advisor of Ukraine, we reached now a level of 20 million. Ukraine lost in 3 decades more than 30 million people. So something must be wrong in this state. This is not a democracy in any kind. We don't find for Western values. This is a military dictatorship, worse than the Russian Federation or other countries. That's the situation. So the West is betraying its own so-called values. And this is just a fight between a unipolar world led by the United States and all the forces who want to reach a multipolar world. And these forces who are fighting for a multipolar world will win.
Patrick, the western part of Ukraine, if they lose Odessa, we know that in the western part they have various factions, various minorities, Romanians, Hungarians, Polish people. And is Europe considering that scenario if something happens in that direction, losing Odessa, Nikolaev, going up to Kharkov? Is Europe capable of taking all the pressure, all the burden coming from Ukraine to Europe? Donald Trump doesn't care about Ukraine anymore. He's in the process of putting all the burden of the war in Ukraine on Europeans. And you don't see any sort of objections on the part of Europeans in that. How is that? What is their understanding in Ukraine as time goes by?
I think the Ukraine will be split up in near future in 2 parts, an eastern part belonging to Russia and a western part close to the West. But I don't know where we will see the split up line. I don't know that. Possibly Odessa, I don't know that. But I know that there are many people in Kiev and Odessa who are waiting for the Russian troops to get liberated. They don't want to live in a dictatorship of Mr. Zelensky. And I think possibly the western part of Ukraine will belong to Poland. And in that case, Galicia, or parts of Galicia whatsoever, will be suddenly part of the NATO and the EU. And possibly this is a way of survival of the European Union, I don't know. But they have to pay the cost of the war, the cost of the weapons, and the cost of the reconstruction. And I think this is far more than $1,000 billion. So who will pay that? That means all the money of the EU will get into Ukraine for the reconstruction. And the farmers in Poland, for example, or in France, they will get nothing. And I can imagine that in such a case, we will run into a situation of civil war in several countries of the European Union. I don't want that, but I expect that. So I think the realistic scenario is Mad Max for Europe.
Yeah. The division, is there any sort of division among Germany, United Kingdom, and France in Ukraine, or they're coming from the same sort of mindset? They know what they want, their objectives are the same. or behind the scene there are some sort of, divisions, some sort of differences among these three countries, the main supporters of Ukraine in Europe?
This coalition of the willing thought in the beginning, in early 2022, they can bring the Russian Federation on its knees by a combination of weapons shipping for Ukraine, sanctions, and diplomatic and political isolation. But nothing worked. They only won the war of narratives, but only in Europe and in the United States, in the NATO countries, not all over the world. Everybody in Russia, China, India, Bangladesh, South Africa, Brazil, Latin America, South America know what this war is about. It's about the question, is the world run by the leadership of an imperialistic West, or can we win a multipolar world? That's the main question of the whole show. And the European leaders underestimated the opponent. And this is the worst mistake you can make in a policy. They underestimated. They tried to bring the Russian Federation on its knees. This strategy failed completely. Now they are all on the loser side, and they have no strategy anymore than continuing the war. With rational politicians, with clear thoughts, you would start a process of negotiation to reduce the destruction and the cost of the war. But they cannot do that because they are so deep in their own ideology. They are prisoners of their own propaganda. They are prisoners of their own strategy. They know they are so deeply involved that they cannot stop. One reason is European politicians and diplomats, as well as diplomats and politicians of the United States, were deeply involved in the organization of the Maidan coup. They negotiated, according to the study of Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa, they negotiated with Ukraine fascists on the number of assassinations that are needed to bring European countries in a situation to press Yanukovych out of office. Both sides agreed on a number of 100 assassinations. And that was the way it worked. And that means some European leaders must be brought into prison. This is a criminal act. They were part of a mass killing, of a mass assassination. And they know that. And those politicians are still in office. And they cannot go back. They must go on with the war because all their lies will come into public. And this is the end, the political end, probably the personal end of those politicians. That's the deeper reason. All over European countries, we need reforms, deep reforms, economically and politically. But the political class will stop that, this process of reforms. It's a question, it's a matter of survival for them.
Thank you so much, Patrik, for being with us today.
Absolutely,
Great
my
pleasure, as
pleasure to
always.
join you. Thanks very much for the invitation. I hope, well, today I thought a bit in a dystopic way, but I think this is not a dystopia, it is realism.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Have a great time there, Patrik.
Have a
See you
great day.
soon.
Bye-bye, and thank you, Nima.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.